The Chat Lounge.
Chat Lounge.
Chat Lounge.
The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
Recently, the term U.S. deadline has been trending across Chinese social media. Originally a term from the gaming world, is now being used to describe the financial fragility haunting everyday Americans. Why are so many people in the U.S., a leading developed nation with the world's largest GDP, just one crisis away from poverty? What does it tell us about the deep-seated institutional gaps in the U.S. social safety net? Welcome to the Chat Lounge. I'm Xu Yawen in Beijing. Today we have two distinguished guests to explore these questions. Professor Li Lun, Assistant Professor of Economics at Peking University, Professor Joseph Gregory Mahoney, Professor of Politics and International Relations at East China Normal University. Welcome to the chat, gentlemen. Professor Li, first of all, we know recently the phrase U.S. deadline have gone viral on Chinese social media, and the deadline is also referred to as the kill line, a term used in Chinese computer game lingo to describe the point at which a player's health is so low that they can be finished with one strike. And it has become a metaphor for Americans living so close to financial collapse that one accident, illness, or unexpected bill could finish them off. So considering your background of living and studying in America for many years, what's your initial reaction when you first heard this phrase?
Yeah, so when I first heard it, I didn't know what it means because it's not a standard term in economics or public policy. It's rather like a, internet slang or like a informal concept. But as you mentioned, it's a concept that's borrowed from gaming, right? So it's a point where, the health bar is so low that, the player can be taken out in one hit. So in this case, it's a metaphor for, American households where they're one shock away from, economic and social status, collapse of their social status. So I think in terms of my initial reaction, I do think I'm not very surprised by the concept because, from my experience living 11 years in the States, I do, find that because people have so low savings and sometimes they'll have high medical cost and each month there's usually a large rental payment and a large, credit card payment. So these things can be a very dangerous combination, not to mention, the drug problem and also, abusive of alcohol, for example. Mm-hmm. So all of these combined, I think, make this phenomenon of the deadline or, the line of no return. Basically, once you cross that line, once you lose your stable housing, once you lose your address, everything else becomes much harder. For example, for your job application, to get proper medical care, even to receive daily meal, those can become, very hard. Mm. So, yeah, I mean, I'm shocked, but not very surprised by the phenomena, I think.
Professor Mahoney, when you first came across the term the U.S. deadline, what was your first impression, and why do you think it gained such a widespread attention on Chinese social media?
Well, when I first heard it, I wasn't entirely aware what the deadline was. In fact, I thought it might be, it reminded me of the old Reagan era term, the line of death that it imposed on Libya. And I thought, is this another Trump rehash from the Reagan administration? Are we talking about a new death line being applied to Venezuela through the blockade there? So that was my initial reaction. But then as I began to study it a little more, it made complete sense to me. I think the key issue here is that Chinese people have become increasingly aware that the United States is a dangerous and difficult place. I think this awareness really began to break through in the Chinese mind during the pandemic, when we saw the catastrophic failure of social policy to deal with the pandemic in the U.S. that resulted in approximately 1.5 million people dying, millions of more who were impacted in serious ways. So I think all of these impressions slowly began to wake up people in China to the conditions in the United States. Certainly, there was a blog that came out of San Francisco that was talking about the dangers and risks that one faces that I think sparked this story. But, at the same time, I think it's also becoming increasingly well known that among developed countries, the U.S. has the highest rate of poverty. It has the highest homicide rate, the highest suicide rate, the highest rate of incarceration, the highest obesity rate, the highest drug addiction rate, and deaths caused by drugs, the highest infant mortality rate, the lowest life expectancy, the highest income inequality, the highest healthcare costs, but the weakest healthcare safety net. And we know that Trump is now moving to cut that safety net further, along with other social welfare supports, while at the same time, blaming other countries, including blaming Venezuela, saying that Venezuela was somehow connected to fentanyl, and that was part of the drug addiction crisis, and declaring fentanyl a weapon of mass destruction, and this in part to justify what was just done against that country, but also bringing similar pressures against China and making allegations, trying to shift this blame and responsibility, when what we really see across the board is the United States in a period of deep social, political, and economic decline. And while we perceive this, I think, in China really starting to break into our consciousness more recently, but certainly in the wake of the pandemic. In fact, it has much older roots going back to the early 1980s, but especially accelerating after the global financial crisis in 2008.
What you have just said remind me of the story when I was studying America in Northern California. There was a joke about international students. If they had an emergency, their first reaction would be, do not call an ambulance because it's too expensive. Some of them, if they had a serious illness, they would buy a plane ticket to return to China for treatment. So, do issues like the high cost of healthcare also affect Americans? And besides expensive medical bills, what other factors collectively contribute to the so-called death line? Professor Lee.
Well, I'm not American, but I can definitely contribute some of my thoughts because I do think there's a combination of factors what you mentioned. So in terms of California, because despite a lot of people move in California, and California is one of the richest states in the U.S., there's a shortage in housing supply, meaning that new constructions of housing, especially buildings with many stories, are usually very hard to implement because of zoning laws. So there's a large and increasing housing demand, but not enough housing supply. So the consequence is that the rent keeps, going up. And for people, especially because there's a lot of income inequality, the prosperous growth of the IT industry doesn't benefit everyone. It doesn't benefit, for example, the cleaning lady or, the people serving the restaurants. So, I mean, these increasing rent, on the other hand, will take a larger and larger portion of their monthly paycheck. And not to mention, for example, they have to pay back their credit card loans. And if they get ill, so it's very common for them to skip their treatment. So according to a report from the Kaiser Family Foundation, about 1/3 of adults in the US say that in the past 12 months they have either skipped or postponed getting health care that they needed because of the cost. And also, the debt from healthcare is a burden for, a large share of Americans. About 4 in 10 adults report having debt due to, medical or dental bills. And that's not including, for example, expenses that happen to a car or your student loan. So once you have your, a large portion of your income taken away from your monthly paycheck, and the rent keeps going up, it's very easy to be affected by a negative shock. For example, a negative health shock, or an unemployment shock. You lose your job and suddenly you can't pay your rent, and for several months, if you can't pay your rent, you're evicted from your apartment. And if you can't find another apartment in time, it's very easy to become homeless. So I think that's where a lot of people, especially young people in China, are somehow both worried and also anxious, but also disillusioned, because they realize it's very easy, and especially in countries like US, the richest country in the world, it's very easy to kind of fall between the gaps, and they're actually just one accident away from total collapse. So that's, I think, what triggers this emotion in social media in China.
Professor Mahoney, so a question for you, since you're from America, how do those social safety nets work when someone falls into financial difficulty or life struggle?
Well, let me tell you three little stories that will echo the one that you told, and then I'll turn directly to that question. The first is I went to university as an undergraduate in the fall of 1989 there in Washington, D.C. And a couple of months after I started school there, D.C. was the site of a massive march organized by a man by the name of Mitch Snyder. It was a march for housing justice, and we call it the Homeless March on Washington. And what he did was he organized or not all, but a very large number of homeless people in New York City, and then they started walking towards Washington. And then they encountered more homeless in Philadelphia. They joined, and then more homeless in Baltimore, and they joined, and then they came all the way down into DC. So we had a huge number of homeless people in Washington demanding social justice. And of course, what's interesting is that those homeless people, once the rally was over, did not turn around and walk back to New York or Philadelphia or Baltimore. They stayed in DC. So we had this huge homeless population in DC for a long time thereafter. Now, this was in response. This was actually the second march that he organized. He organized one in 1984. And this was in response to the policies that had been put in place by Ronald Reagan that had cut social welfare support, had closed mental health hospitals, and had pushed a large number of people out onto the streets who were unable to take care of themselves, including a large number of people who were mentally ill. And this was something that had then motivated Mitch Snyder to try to create some sort of social justice. Unfortunately, he would commit suicide a few years later, given his own mental health issues, which I think was part of what was driving his personal empathy with the people that he was trying to help. But just to say that, you had these experiences in California in the 2000s, and we were already experiencing a substantial homeless problem in the 1980s because of the overturning of social welfare and social supports. The second thing is, in the early 2000s, I was back in Washington to work on a PhD program, and I had a fellow student who was from Mongolia, and she was on a scholarship from her government and had a dental emergency, like I think a dental bridge that she had failed. And the Mongolian embassy bought her a ticket to Cuba, and she had to fly through Canada because you couldn't fly directly from the United States to Cuba. She had to fly up to Toronto and then down to Havana, where she received medical care, dental care in Havana, and then fly back to Washington. That this was cheaper for the Mongolian government than providing dental care for her in the United States. So this it gives you a sort of an interesting index of part of the problem here. The third thing is in 2020, I had gone back to the United States ahead of Christmas 2019 to see my parents for the holiday, and I got trapped in the U.S. with the outbreak of COVID. And because I'm a permanent resident in China, I have health insurance in China. Because I was in an uncertain position in the U.S., I did not immediately acquire health insurance. I thought I might be able to get out faster than I did. And I was also in very good health. But suddenly I developed what proved to be a kidney stone. And my parents live about 40 kilometers outside of Memphis, Tennessee, which is not a very expensive place. And so I had to seek emergency medical care from a hospital in North Memphis, a hospital that serves a low-income population. And all I got when I went to that hospital was a CT to confirm that I had a kidney stone and a prescription for painkillers to help me survive that difficult moment. Because I didn't have U.S. health insurance, I was given a poverty rate, a discounted rate. You want to take a guess what my bill was for a CT scan and a 5-minute consultation with a doctor? You want to guess how much that bill
Probably,
was?
probably over $1,000.
It was $12,000.
I'm about to guess 50,000, so
Wow,
I'm
that's
but it's
crazy.
still pretty outrageous.
Yeah.
Yes.
$12,000, right? And again, that's the discounted rate for poor people. And so, and my mother, of course, was like, "I told you to get health insurance." I told you, and I'm like sometimes my
Wait,
mother is
so you
right
don't have, how come as a US citizen you don't have health insurance from your country?
because we don't have it.
Okay, so you have to purchase health insurance
That's
from
right.
companies so that you can afford to have
Well,
those
there
companies
are
to pay for
two
those
there
bills.
there are two or three things here. The first is there was a policy put in place that we call the Affordable Care Act that was put in place by during the Obama administration. But what this law did was require people to buy health insurance
Okay.
with some support from the government. Now, people,
What's the minimum down payment that you have to put in order to get basic healthcare insurance?
well, it varies. It varies by your age and your risk factors. It also varies by where you live, and it varies in terms of what kind of deductible you will accept. So, will you accept a $500 deductible, a $1,000 deductible? What sort of coverage do you want? Up to $50,000, up to $100,000. So the prices, there are a multitude of price points. And the cheaper policies generally require a deductible where over the course of a year you would have to exceed payments of out-of-pocket payments of $500 or more before you would start to see benefits. And of course, one of the problems is not all of the procedures that you might get from your doctor, not all of them might be covered by the policy. It could be disputed. So there is some support for people through the Medicare and Medicaid programs, but this requires demonstrating a certain type of poverty, and this requires an extensive procedure. A lot of people are not able to get or maintain these benefits, and through
Well,
time, these benefits have also declined in value. So there is no national health insurance. There is no reliable means for protecting. But as I said before, the U.S. has by far the highest cost per capita, but also percentage of GDP in the world when it comes to healthcare, but also the worst public support for those costs as a social safety net in the developed world, and by some estimates in the entire world.
The Chat Lounge. The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
Professor Lee, so could you help us understand how difficult is it for homeless people to get back to normal life and reintegrate it into mainstream society, despite the fact that the U.S. has programs like Medicaid and unemployment insurance?
Yeah, so my personal experience, or anecdotally, I think it's pretty difficult, and it's not, just a small group of the society or the population that's homeless, that's special, because they're lazy or they deal drugs or they have mental problems that they become homeless. There's a story on PBS NewsHour where they call it the working homeless phenomenon. So even for full-time workers, they're still unable to afford their housing, so they can still be homeless. For example, people may start by living in their car, and when the ends don't meet, they may end up selling their car and living in a tent or living under the bridge. So even if they're trying to maintain a full-time worker, for example, some people take the shower at their workplace and try to make ends meet, they still cannot pay back their rent. And also, what we have been discussing is that the medical, especially for people with chronic disease or mental disease, where they need to have constant prescription of drugs, that adds additional cost to their monthly bills. So even if you don't pay your rent, you live off the street, you still have to pay to get your food, to have somewhere to store your personal belongings, to charge your phone. So it's very difficult. And once they lost their job, it's very difficult to kind of, maintain their personal hygiene and go to another job interview and stay healthy enough to work in another place. So it's very difficult to climb out of that trap once you get to it. Of course, the affordability crisis and the rising inflation rate only, adds to it, because when the food prices have becoming higher and higher, it's becoming increasingly hard to, afford your, daily meal. And that only makes things, even worse.
That reminds me of a story I covered when I was in California. I saw this lady sitting on the curb of the street, and then I spoke with her. She told me local police officer, that's the city they called Arcata in Northern California, issued her a ticket because of her sitting on the curb of the street. She's already homeless, right? She cannot afford to pay for the ticket. And then they would give her two options. Either you do social works, like cleaning the highways, or you go to the jail. She has some issue with her legs, so it would be very challenging for her to do those social works. But if she goes to the jail, then that would give her a bad record, making her even more difficult to find a job in the future. That's the story happened a decade ago, only in certain places in America. So, Professor Mahoney, what has the government done to provide this kind of supportive network nowadays in America to help those homeless people get back to normal life, to ensure they can have a decent living?
Well, I would suggest that part of the challenge here is that you're thinking about this like a Chinese person. And if we think, for example, how China has helped 700 to 800 million people rise out of poverty, if we think about how China has mobilized to eliminate extreme poverty, we think very specifically about central government working with local government and implementing policies that aim to produce real results. This is not the way the U.S. works at all. So in the case of the U.S., you have a federal system where most of the supports are provided at the state level, and even within the state can vary considerably by county or municipality. So, and above all, the federal system, while the federal system does play a significant role in programs like Medicare, Medicaid, or even pushing through very market-friendly, insurance company-friendly policies like Obamacare, they cannot really impose on states how to take care of citizens at the local level. So there is no direct line the way you would conceptualize it in China for solving these kinds of problems. The bigger issue is that why do we see so many homeless in certain parts of California? It's because California is what we call a blue state. They may have more lenient laws, more friendly laws that are less likely to criminalize or victimize people who are in difficult situations. The weather is nicer, so it's easier to survive. So, I think that there are reasons why you see certain areas having more homeless or more people having needs, even if those needs are not ultimately being met. Maybe perhaps they're not being criminalized or further victimized.
Professor Lee, if we compare the social welfare systems in China and in the United States in terms of their approaches to economic crisis and providing social safety nets for people's well-being, what measures has the Chinese government implemented to prevent ordinary people from falling below the death line?
Yeah, so I think one thing that I wanted to add to our discussion is that, a lot of, for US's case, a lot of medical insurance is bonded with their jobs. So basically, once you lose your job, you automatically, lose your medical insurance. When we're talking about Chinese government's measures, we have a broad but basic coverage, but it covers over 1.3 billion people in 2024. Their basic medical needs. So even if you lose your job, you don't lose the basic insurance for your medical bills. And also in terms of the affordability, the prices, if you go to the hospital and do a CT scan, I think the cost won't be too large. Even if you don't have, the medical insurance, it will be just, 100 yuan to a couple hundred yuan max. It won't be, a disastrous expense for the ordinary people. And also in terms of, the safety net or DBAO system, there's around 40 million recipients of these DBAO allowances, both in, urban and rural areas, but there's also, targeted aid for extreme poverty and extreme hardship cases once China, basically target to eliminate the, extreme poverty and list it as one of the, policy priorities. And I think in terms of the mindset, Chinese government have a prevention mindset instead of waiting for the problem to happen and then to solve it. So in terms of our jieda or the local level, administrative unit, both in terms of monitoring, in terms of providing temporary assistance to the elderly, to provide employment support, at the community level for the disabled, for low-income households, I think we're providing ample support for these potentially to be marginalized group. And also in terms of the family support or the informal support, I think it definitely helps in China's case, because once it's very common, for example, to have someone if someone loses his or her job in Beijing or Shanghai, they could move to another city or move closer to their parents. So that's very common, but I think it's less common in the US, and that's also, potentially explaining some of that difference in terms of, the deadline.
I've been speaking with Professor Li Luan, Assistant Professor of Economics at Peking University, and Professor Joseph Gregory Mahoney, Professor of Politics and International Relations at East China Normal University. For the second half of the program, we shift gears to China's Global Governance Initiative, or GGI. My colleague Ge Anna speaks with two experts from China and Malaysia to delve into how the GGI addresses the unfairness in the current global governance system. Stay with us.
Sideline Story brings you all things sports related. The hottest topics, latest events, juiciest stories, all with a very personal take. Subscribe to Sideline Story Podcast for heated sports discussions covering events that are happening in China and around the world.
Welcome back to Chat Lounge. I'm Xu Yawen in Beijing. Amid rising geopolitical tensions, escalating climate risks, and growing concerns over the governance of emerging technologies like the artificial intelligence, the world is confronting a confluence of long-standing and new challenges. These pressures have further exposed the widening global governance deficits, placing unprecedented strain on the existing international order. In response, China put forward the Global Governance Initiative in September last year, offering a set of principles and pathways to reform and strengthen global governance at this critical juncture. The GGI emphasizes sovereign equality, the rule of law, multilateralism, people-centered development, and tangible outcomes, aiming for a more just and equitable system that includes the Global South. How does the GGI address the inequities in the current global governance system? And what role will China play in turning this vision into concrete action? My colleague Ge Anna speaks with Dr. Li Peimei, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the International Islamic University, Malaysia, and Dr. Zhou Mi, Senior Research Fellow of Institute of World Economy at Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation.
China has a new vision for global governance, one that emphasizes equality, shared responsibility, and the voices of developing countries.
奉行主权平等。
We should adhere to sovereign
坚持各
equality.
国无论大小、强弱、贫
We should
富，
maintain that
都
all
在全
countries,
球治理中
regardless of
平等参
size,
与
strength, and wealth,
平等
are
决策
equal participants, decision makers, and beneficiaries in
推
global
进国际
governance.
关系民主
We should
化，
promote greater
提
democracy
升
in
发展中
international
国家的代
relations
表性，
and increase
发言
the
权。
representation and voice of developing countries.
倡导以人为本，
We should advocate the
改革完
people-centered
善全
approach.
球治理体系，保
We
障
should
各国人
reform and
民
improve the global
共同
governance
参与
system
全
to
球治理，
ensure that
共
the
享
people
全
of
球治
every
理成
nation
果，
are the actors in
更
and
好应对
beneficiaries
人类
of
社会面临
global
的共同
governance,
挑战，
so as to better
更好
tackle
弥
the
合
common challenges
南
for
北发
mankind,
展鸿沟，
better narrow
更
the
好维护世界
north-south
各
gap,
国共同利
and
益。
better safeguard the common interests of all countries.
President Xi Jinping's Global Governance Initiative has drawn immediate attention from nations around the world.
To warmly and support the Global Governance Initiative presented by the President of the People's Republic of China, our good friend Xi Jinping. We really believe that if we want to build a community of a shared future, we need an initiative like this.
A lot of problems we have now, it is difficult to do it alone, but in rethinking the global governance through global governance initiative proposed by the President Xi Jinping, I am really confident that we could really change the world, create a new era, and live in new international order.
The initiative has been praised as timely, coming at a moment of multiple global crises and waning confidence in multilateralism.
China solved a very difficult equation, the equation that balancing domestic modernization with the global responsibility. The point actually of the high standard opening up means that China has the good intention to deal with the world with the best they can do. I want to say that China is not rising alone. China is rising with the intention of lifting others. The success of China is an opportunity for many.
For decades, we lived in a largely unipolar world. But now we stand firmly in a multipolar global system where power, ideas, and influence are widely distributed. Global governance today must also confront a rapidly changing technological landscape. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, quantum computing, and digital governance are transforming our world at a breathtaking speed. These advances offer unprecedented opportunities, but also profound risks. This is why global governance must now extend to data ethics and the moral implications of technology. In other words, we must place moral and ethical questions at the heart of global decision-making.
Equality, responsibility, and a vision. How will the Global Governance Initiative shape cooperation and redefine international engagement? This is World Today, our year-end special. Professor Li, when President Xi first proposed the Global Governance Initiative, he said global governance should treat all countries as equal players, decision makers, and beneficiaries. From your perspective, what's the biggest thing that's not working in today's global governance system, and what kind of a solution is the GGI really offering?
Well, I think in today's global governance system, many actually viewed it as being very unfair and unequal. So I think this is one of the main reasons why countries, especially developing countries, they kind of dislike the current global governance system, because the current system only allows the privileged one to make important political, economic, and social decisions. But that decisions itself are going to affect the whole world. So in it, the way how the decision is being made is very clearly very unequal and unfair. So other countries, what are their rules? They can only take the role of bystanders. So without the ability to truly contribute to the decision-making process. Therefore, very often we see that the decisions being made are often disproportionately favoring one side, which is the decision maker. So for Global Governance Initiative, it's very different because it's promoting multilateralism, it's promoting, creating space for developing countries to also voice out their concerns and also their demands. So you can say that the Global Governance Initiative actually offers countries the opportunities to participate equally as participants as well as decision makers. So in that, by having such space and opportunities for developing countries to participate equally, you can expect that the outcome of the decisions that will be made would be taking consideration of all parties and does not only benefit one or some countries.
Dr. Zhou Mi, what do you make of this? How does this new vision speak directly to the problems we see in the current global order? What kind of world does the GGI ultimately seek to promote?
Well, I agree with Professor Li's opinions on, some kind of unfair practices or mechanisms based on certain group of countries. But I want to emphasize that there are even some worse situation. That is, some countries or more than 160 members have joined WTO. They have made some commitments. Nowadays, we're seeing some countries want to violate their commitments. They were not just trying to fulfill their commitments. So the governance issue is not only about some new areas, it's also about some traditional ways of doing businesses. Like the globalizations are based on, so many kind of respect from different sides, no matter whether it's strong or weak. But if we are able to reach this agreement that we will follow the several principles like the most favored nations, the national treatment, and also the transparency, these three important principles of WTO, we have to fulfill our commitments like keep the tariffs lower and also trying to make some trade facilitation for the different stakeholders. But if we are going to violate our commitments, I don't think that we have the base for discussion of the new areas. In other words, I would say that we are between the two very important issues. The first one is how can we continue with our traditional relations or commitments made to the WTO, to the multilateral system. And another one is how can we deal with the new issues like the digital trade, like something to do with the green trade, or whether there will be more protectionism. So we have to deal with both sides to trying to have a better governance. And the governance is benefiting all of us, not just a part of us.
Then, Dr. Zhou Mi, from the early reactions we've seen, what are developing countries hoping to get from the GGI?
You can find that in the recent 2 years, we are seeing the Global South countries are really working very hard to trying to have a better platform. These platforms are really important for them to continue with their efforts of being involved in the global trade. Well, many of the developing countries are really want to have a better space for development based on the trade, on the fair trade with other countries with low tariffs and more access of the market. So based on that, kind of expectation, they really want to have some governance that are taking their demands as one of the priorities. They need some platform that they can speak for themselves. So for many countries, like the agriculture products as one example, is one of many developing countries' priorities. They want to reduce the different treatment in the platform, like in WTO. Many developing countries argue that most of the developed countries have put so much money to subsidize the farmers. So they want them to reduce the subsidies, but in the developed country, they do not want to do that. So in this regard, they want some platform to keep the subsidies in our sustainable way, not just trying to distort the order for the global trade in the agricultural products. So I would say that developing countries are really want to have more trust from each other and also to reach some kind of commitments, and they want to fulfill them. They need some enforcement mechanisms to deal with the disputes. And they believe that these are really important for them to speak for themselves, not just to listen to the others while they change their attitudes from year to year.
Professor Lee, how Malaysia viewing about the initiative? Do you think this support from Global South, for example, is driven more by frustration with the Western-led order or by specific ideas in the GGI like sovereign equality or closing the North-South gap that feel more realistic and reliable?
I think both. First, I think developing countries have long viewed that the current order does not give them enough space to voice out their concerns and voices. And as for Malaysia, actually, in the past decade, I think we have always pushed for multilateralism. So we are basically against unilateralism, which is basically what the current global order is about. So, but at the same time, when you look at Global Governance Initiative, basically it's promoting that, it's promoting multilateralism, it's promoting non-interference, respect for sovereignty. So for Malaysia itself, we think these are something very important because as a small state, we are not happy or not inclined for major powers to actually intervene in our domestic affairs. And actually that's happening. So for example, currently there might be geopolitical competition between countries and then one side might try to, force Malaysia to take sides. So this is something that Malaysia, does not want that to happen. So GGI basically is promoting the core values that aligns with Malaysian national goals like respecting sovereignty, non-interference, and they also talks about giving more, space in the international relations for countries to participate, and many more. And another thing I would like to add on is that for developing countries, and especially for those countries that in the past they have been invaded by the West, they mainly would support GGI. So for example, like, Afghanistan and then Iraq, countries like this, because they already face the consequences of being intervened by the West. So these are the countries that I think would, strongly support GGI because it resonates with what they want.
Mm-hmm. Professor, many politicians openly say the world has moved from a unipolar system to a multipolar one. Do you see this shift making global governance harder, or does it actually create a real opportunity for the more democratic international relations that the GGI talks about?
I think there is consensus that the world is no longer a unipolar world. Jeffrey Sachs, an American economist and public policy analyst, also shared the same assessment. Yeah, but as we know, when a system is going through the transition, there will be some instability, there will be some adjustment, and there will be some heightened uncertainty, which we are witnessing today. So, like what I mentioned earlier, we're probably seeing some intensified geopolitical competitions. The reason is because the hegemon, the sole power, is actually trying to keep its predominant place. So it would try its best to use various means to stop the world from turning to a multipolar system. So during this time, we have witnessed like what just now Professor Jomi said, tariff. So some countries, the hegemon itself, are using tariff to prevent that transition. And then we're also witnessing that hegemon using economic sanctions on other countries or even threat of war to stop that transition. But to be honest, I think the decline of the hegemon is very evident. Hence, I believe we're moving towards a more democratic international relations. And as China is promoting Global Governance Initiative that emphasizes on basically equality, equal participations, and multilateralism, I think we could really move towards a more democratic international relations because GGI is also supported and embraced by other countries.
The Chat Lounge. The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
Dr. Jomi, do you think a more multipolar world makes global governance harder, or does it open the door to a more democratic international relations?
I would say that, when we're now in such a world based on the multilateral systems, like for WTO, it's not that easy. So I still remember some people, they talked with me. They said that when we have reached such kind of, WTO-based system, it has costed us, millions or dozens of millions of people's lives. So we have a very difficult time to reach that kind of status. I don't want to say that we want to abandon nowadays mechanism to try to find some new one. But I would say that there are so many things that we need to do more reform, like for the reform of WTO, like the reform to introduce more people's voting rights in IMF and World Bank. So I think that is naturally very important because the world is changing. The world is changing to not just one country take a part of maybe occupy half of the GDP globally. There are so many new powers or new countries are emerging. They have more demands. The trade patterns, investment patterns, companies' distributions are all different from the past. So we are just about to enter a new era of the digital trade or artificial intelligence era. There are so many new things. If we are able to provide some of the advices or opinions from different sides, I think seems to be more reasonable. And the governance is a kind of a very high level of order. So based on the different opinions, maybe we can try to find some mutual understanding, some common consensus on certain areas. We can start from that. The GGI is a kind of initiative, as for the Belt and Road Initiative, it's not just decided by China. We just propose that. So based on this kind of mechanism, we want to propose that maybe all of the related and the interested groups can join this initiative to discuss about their requirement. They can just, tell others about what they really want. And I think that is a kind of important mechanism for all of us to try to find a more balanced way of doing businesses. The GGI is a kind of a very new initiative. It's a reflection of Chinese philosophy that we want to have the different opinions from different sides. We can discuss about what are the most important and reasonable ways of governing. And I think that is more sustainable compared with just one country to decide everything. So I would say that maybe have more advantages, and we have to respect this new platform. We are also encouraged to join this kind of discussion.
Dr. Zhou Mi, China often says that high-level opening up is a key way to advance the GGI. Based on what we've seen in 2025, like freer trade zones, regional trade deals, and opening up services, how's China using its own openness to push improvements in global economic governance?
Well, I think that China, at the beginning of the century, China is a latecomer to the multilateral system. So we accept all the set rules, like I mentioned in WTO. After almost more than 2 decades, we have changed a lot internally in the domestic laws and regulations to fit for the requirement of the multilateral system. But now we are entering a new phase. I think that the world is facing too many uncertainties, and the trade regime, we're not seeing some new rules or governance, developed together with the economy itself. In the free trade zone, as you mentioned, we are trying to encourage the different areas to trying to explore which is the best practices to do with trade, global trade or the regional trade and the investment. In the different areas, we want to do some kind of practices to try to do some experiment. Based on this experiment, we will be able to deliver some better idea about the governance. Like in the Hainan Free Trade Port, for example, we trying to explore the new ways of doing the cross-border trading services in the negative list based. So, it is actually our unilaterally opening up. We are doing that by ourselves. So based on the practices in Hainan, we just modified our foreign trade law, and we have introduced this new mechanism in the law itself. So, it is kind of a very good practices and good example to show that China is willing to just trying to change our ways of managing the trade and investment based on the real economic status. And we also want to share our experiences with our trading partners. Like, we just concluded the negotiation with ASEAN about the free trade agreement 3.0 to introducing more digital trade and also the green trade. I think that kind of practices can also to give more ideas to our partners on how can we provide the enterprises with better environment. I mean, that is kind of just examples. We want to do more to introduce, to do some experiments first and then introduce some of our experiences and also to share our lessons with our trading partners. I think based on these kind of practices, we can have a better understanding about what should be the right thing and how can we proceed with the new things which is good for the businesses.
As we look at this initiative that was just introduced in 2025, even though the GGI has gained a lot of support, there is pushback from unilateralism and power politics, and some countries are still watching to see how things play out. Professor Li, what do you see as the biggest obstacles right now, and how can the GGI move from ideas to real actions?
Yes, I think one of the main challenge would be the narrative. The West is trying to shape the narrative that GGI is a way for China to basically dominate the world. So they are actually trying to warn other countries from getting too involved with China. So this might be one of the challenge of its implementation. So what I would say is that they really need to be counter-narrative to that idea. So one of the way to promote counter-narrative is for China to organize some dialogues about GGI, just like what Dr. Zhou Mi said just now. Basically, GGI is still very new, it's taking shape. So China is just proposing the ideas, outlining the ideas how GGI core values are, which are, to be honest, quite universal, because I think all the countries, developing countries, they love to have their sovereignty being respected. They want to be treated equally. They want to be parties to be able to participate in decision making at a global level. So it would be useful that they have dialogues with countries to think about how this new governance model should be. So I think this can better translate GGI principles into more concrete outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Zhou Mi, what's your take? What do you think are the main challenges at the moment? And how can the GGI turn its vision into tangible results in the coming years?
Yeah, I think that's the most important thing is for us to trying to start, not just, to start to act, not just to talk. Mm-hmm. So actually, ZGI is not just a kind of a very virtual concept. It has a real implication about the practices, about the laws, regulations on the trade and the investment. Can we do more to trying to, to strengthen our commitments in the multilateral system and fulfill any kind of the disputes coming from the disputes mechanism from WTO? I would say that we need to respect that because we are now seeing some countries or economies are trying to, change their commitments to WTO. I don't think that is a good way. So first we have to overcome, or trying to take back to fight against some protectionism pressure. And second, I think that is very natural for us to deal with the new issues because the digital trades are increasing so quickly. We need to give some of our practices on that mechanism. And these are really our challenges we have to deal with. So maybe we can start from certain, smaller interested groups, and we can expand this mechanism to a wider range. And I believe that the good examples can really have more attractive, more economies will join this kind of games and play very promising and sustainable way of, making the businesses a bit more friendly and easy to be done.
Professor Li, looking ahead to 2026, where do you think the GGI will focus next, and which areas might see real breakthroughs?
Well, I think climate governance is one of the way where GGI can actually focus on it because the U.S. is basically withdrawing from it. So the U.S. has really declared that it's not participating in the Paris Agreement. And in fact, they are the largest polluter, yet they are withdrawing from it. So what it means is that other countries need to step in. It's not only China, but China could play the leading role in driving, climate governance. But other countries should also work hand in hand with China to discuss and come up with a more concrete plan to fight climate change. Because as we know, countries like those maritime countries, they are the one most affected by climate change. And a lot of developing countries, they are facing more serious threats of climate change because they do not have the money, they do not have the fund to fight it. So I think it's GGI may offer some ideas on how countries can actually better fight climate change together. So besides that, I think what we can do is you can try to link GGI with explicitly to UN reform proposals. As we say, GGI and UN and existing mechanism and institutions are not exclusive. In fact, GGI values and principles can actually drive current mechanism. So it will be useful to try to link GGI with UN reform proposals, with IMF reform proposals, and with other reform proposals.
With that, we're wrapping up this episode of Chat Lounge. Thank you so much for listening. Bye for now.